The desert does not forgive the weak. It swallows them whole, wraps them in silence, and leaves no trace behind. But sometimes, in the scorching heart of the dunes, something unexpected breathes. Something quiet and fierce all at once. Something that does not ask for mercy and does not beg for salvation. Sometimes, the desert chooses its own. She was walking alone. That was the first thing anyone would notice about her. The solitude that wrapped around her like a second skin, familiar and worn, as natural as the red cloth of her servant's dress, dragging softly against the golden sand. Her name was Clea Legaster, and she was 19 years old, and she had learned long ago that the world rarely offers its hand to girls like her. So she had stopped waiting for it. She walked. She worked. She carried her small bag of medicinal herbs and her few earned coins from one dusty village to the next, tending to the sick, preparing remedies by firelight, asking for nothing more than enough to continue moving forward. The sun that afternoon was the kind that pressed down like a weight on the shoulders, relentless and ancient, as if the sky itself was made of iron. The wind carried sand in lazy spirals across the cracked earth, and the road stretched ahead of her like a pale scar cut through the land. There were no trees here, no shade. Only the open expanse of the desert south, and the distant blur of dunes that rose and fell like the breathing of some enormous sleeping creature buried beneath the world. She was heading to a small outpost beyond the third ridge, a place the locals simply called the Stone Well, where several families had fallen ill with a fever that the local healers could not identify. She had prepared the right mixture herself: dried thorn leaf, crushed pale root, and a powder extracted from the inner bark of the silver shrub that grew only near underground water. It had taken her 3 weeks to gather everything. 3 weeks of early mornings, blistered hands, and bartered coin. The bag was light. The walk was long, and someone was watching. They had been watching for some time. From behind a cluster of sandstone formations half swallowed by the dunes, 7 men crouched in the narrow shadows. They were not soldiers. They were not merchants. They were the kind of men the desert produces when desperation runs long enough and shame runs short. Renegades, cast out from the pack structures that governed life across the southern territories. Men without allegiance, without rank, without the wolf bond that gave meaning to belonging. They had survived the years since their expulsion by preying on the isolated roads, targeting travelers light enough to carry worth and alone enough to carry no protection. When they saw her, they did not hesitate. 1 Omega, 1 girl, 1 small bag. The tallest among them, a broad-shouldered man with a jaw like stone and eyes the color of dried blood, watched her approach and allowed himself a slow, ugly smile. An Omega, walking alone in the desert, he murmured to the others. Someone must have forgotten to tell her how the world works. The one beside him, leaner, with a long scar cutting from his left ear to his chin, checked the angle of the sun. She's been walking for a while, tired. Not much fight in those. There's never much fight in them, the tall one answered. That's why they're Omegas. They waited until she was close enough, until the sound of her footsteps against the sand was soft but clear, until they could see the white of her hair catching the desert light like something luminous and strange. Then they rose. All 7 of them. They stepped out from the rocks and spread across the road in a loose arc, blocking every direction of escape with the ease of men who had done this many times before. Clea stopped. She did not cry out. She did not run. She stood very still, the bag held close to her chest, her pale eyes moving steadily across the line of men in front of her. Something in her posture, not defiance exactly, but a kind of deep, practiced calm, made the tall one blink once before he remembered to sneer. Well? He spread his arms as if welcoming an old friend. An Omega servant, alone, with a nice little bag. He tilted his head. This must be the easiest afternoon of my life. The one on the far left pointed at the bag. Hand it over, and we'll let you walk away. The bag, and whatever's in your pockets. Klaya looked at the bag. Then she looked at the men. "There are sick people waiting for these herbs," she said, and her voice was even, low, unhurried. "People who will die without them." The tall one laughed. It was not a kind laugh. And yet... She tightened her grip on the bag. She did not move. For a moment, no one did. The wind slid between them, carrying fine particles of sand, and the afternoon sun stretched their shadows long and thin across the road. The air smelled of heat and dust and something metallic, the way the desert smells when it is holding its breath before a storm. Then the man with the scar began to walk toward her. He had taken perhaps 3 steps when one of the others, a short, wiry figure near the end of the line, suddenly stopped moving. His eyes dropped to the sand. He stared. He took 1 slow step backward. "Wait." No one listened. The scarred man kept walking. "Wait," the short one said again, louder this time. "There are tracks." That stopped them. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube. Extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. Every head turned toward the sand. The short man was crouching now, pressing his fingers near a mark in the ground. A print. Enormous. Far too large for a dog. Far too wide for any common animal found on the southern roads. The kind of print that suggested weight. Real, substantial, predatory weight. And a stride that spoke of something built for speed over vast distances. And there was another one. And another beyond that. The prints came from the direction of the eastern dunes, but they were fresh. The edges had not yet been softened by the wind. "Those are," the short man began. He did not finish, because that was the moment the sound came. It rolled down from the tops of the dunes like thunder that had forgotten how to be thunder. Not a crash or a crack, but something lower and more continuous. A resonance that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and settle directly in the chest. A sound made not from air and force, but from something older than both. A warning, a declaration, a growl. And then they appeared, 2 of them, cresting the ridgelines of the nearest dunes on either side of the road simultaneously, as if they had rehearsed this arrival for an audience. They came down the slope slowly, deliberately, massive paws pressing each step into the gold sand, with the unhurried confidence of creatures that have never needed to rush. Their coats were white, not gray-white or cream-white, but the clean, brilliant white of fresh snow, radiant in the afternoon sun, almost impossible in this landscape of amber and ochre. Their eyes burned. 1 pair pale gold, 1 pair pale blue, both fixed on the line of 7 men with an intelligence that was deeply, unmistakably intentional. They were enormous. Not the size of the wolves that sometimes wandered the desert margins, lean and hollow-ribbed from hunger. These were something else entirely. Taller at the shoulder than most men's waists, broad-chested, built like something between a wolf and a small draft horse, with the fluid muscle movement of a creature designed by nature to be apex, to be final, to be the last thing in the food chain rather than anything in the middle. They descended to the flat of the road and took up positions, 1 on Klaya's left, 1 on her right, and they stopped there, and they were still, and the only thing moving about them was the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of their enormous rib cages. The 7 men did not move. The tall one had stopped smiling. The scarred man had stopped walking. No one was speaking. The desert itself seemed to be listening. Then the wolf on the left, the one with the gold eyes, turned its massive head toward the scarred man who had been approaching Clea, and it opened its mouth, and the sound that came out of it was not a bark, and not a howl, and not quite a growl, but something that contained all three. Something that seemed to say with absolute anatomical clarity that there was a line in the sand between where that man was standing and where he must not step, and that this line was non-negotiable. The scarred man stepped back. Then he kept stepping back. And then the tall one took a step back too, and the short one, and the man on the far end, and all at once 7 men who had been predators 12 seconds ago became something else entirely. 7 men who understood, with the specific intelligence of bodies that remember fear before minds can name it, that they were standing in front of something that would not negotiate and did not bluff. They ran. There was no coordination to it, no dignified retreat, just the sudden explosive scatter of men across the sand, sprinting in different directions, abandoning the road entirely, climbing the nearest dunes with desperate scrambling energy, and disappearing over the ridges and down the other side into the empty distance of the desert. And then there was silence. Clea stood very still for a long moment after they were gone. She could hear her own heartbeat, steadier than she expected. She looked to her left, then to her right, at the 2 white wolves who had not moved, who were still positioned on either side of her with the patient authority of something that had decided a long time ago where it was going to stand and had simply not yet been given a reason to stand anywhere else. She looked at them for a long time. Then slowly, she crouched down, making herself smaller, making herself soft, and extended one hand toward the wolf on her left. The one with the gold eyes. She did not command or summon. She simply offered. The wolf regarded her hand. It regarded her face. It leaned forward and pressed its great cold nose against her palm, drew in a long breath, and something in the set of its shoulders changed. A loosening, an opening. The way wild things look when they decide to allow something rather than merely tolerate it. It sat. Clea released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Hello," she whispered, and there was nothing in her voice but gentleness. No fear, no performance. Just the simple, genuine warmth of a person who has never learned to be afraid of living things, only of the empty spaces between them. The second wolf, the one with the pale blue eyes, moved closer on her right side and lowered its enormous head until its jaw rested on her shoulder. A gesture so absurdly tender for a creature of that size that Clea almost laughed. Instead, her eyes filled with something quiet and overwhelmed. She stayed with them until the sun had moved an inch across the sky. Then she stood, adjusted her bag, and continued walking toward the stone well. The wolves watched her go, and stayed watching long after she had disappeared into the shimmer of the horizon. She did not learn their names for several days. She arrived at the outpost, distributed her herbs, sat up through 2 nights beside feverish children and aging grandmothers, and by the 3rd morning, the fever had broken in 4 of the 7 afflicted, with the others improving steadily. She accepted a handful of dried dates and 2 copper coins as payment, more than she needed, less than anyone else would have charged, and began the walk back toward the village of Ashran's Gate, where the healer Mardith had asked her to return with news. She did not tell anyone about the wolves. It wasn't that she thought they would disbelieve her. It was something else, a feeling she couldn't quite name, the sense that what had happened on that road belonged to her alone, that to offer it up to explanation or analysis would cost it something essential. So she carried it quietly, the way she carried most things that mattered. But the desert has its own way of recording events, and sand holds stories in the layered memory of its grains. Several days after the incident, a patrol from the northern garrison of Mykonos territory came through the eastern road on their standard route. They were not looking for anything in particular. It was a routine survey of the commercial corridors, the kind of sweep that happened 3 times in every moon cycle, to ensure the roads were clear for the caravans that moved goods between the salt flats and the city of Dakareth. The patrol leader was a man named Soren, a compact, careful soldier with 20 years of desert service behind him, and the particular attentiveness that comes from 2 decades of reading terrain. He noticed the marks before anyone else did. The scattered footprints of men who had fled in all directions, the disturbed sand patterns of something that had stood very large and very still, and threading through all of it, crisp, distinctive, unmistakable, the paired prints of Astheron and Bionther. Sorun had served under Dornant Mykonos for 11 years. He knew those prints. He stood over them for a long time, turning the story in his mind the way a man turns a coin to read both faces. Someone had been on this road, someone smaller, someone alone. The pressed sand suggested lightweight. The stride suggested unhurried movement. Someone who had been walking rather than running before and after. A lone traveler. And Astheron and Bionther had flanked them, had stood guard. That last part was what made him stop. That last part was what made him take a long, careful look at the departing footprints of 7 large men and understand what he was reading. He wrote it down in his patrol log with particular care, and when the patrol returned to the garrison that evening, he flagged the notation with the mark they used for reports of unusual significance, and sent a copy forward along the chain of communication that would, within 2 days, reach the desk of the Alpha King himself. Dornant Mykonos read the patrol report at dawn, alone in the high stone room he used as a working study, while the first pale light bled across the desert outside his window, and the city of Dakareth began its slow, layered waking beneath him. He read the report twice. Then he set it down and looked out at the desert. He was 34 years old. He had governed this territory for 9 years, inheriting it from his father in circumstances that were violent and sudden, and that he did not speak about to anyone. He had spent those 9 years building roads and trade routes, water systems and garrison networks, the careful, unglamorous architecture of stability that most people only noticed when it was absent. He was not, by reputation, a man of warmth. He was a man of precision, of implication, of the kind of authority that does not need to raise its voice because it has never needed to. The wolves had been a gift from his grandmother on the day he took leadership. 2 white pups, barely weaned, small enough to fit in the crook of one arm. His grandmother had bred the lineage for 3 generations, selecting for intelligence, for bonding capacity, for the specific quality she called discernment, the ability of a trained wolf to read the character of a person, not just their surface behavior, but something deeper. She had told him, on the day she handed them over, they will like who they like, and they will not be argued out of it. In 9 years, Astheron and Bionther had never chosen anyone beyond him, and a small circle of his most trusted people. They did not warm to strangers. They did not approach travelers or offer themselves to be petted. They were not cold animals. They were simply selective, in the way that only truly intelligent creatures can afford to be. The report said they had flanked someone unknown and stood guard over them while driving off 7 armed men. He read it a 3rd time. Then he folded it and put it in the inner pocket of his coat. "Find out who was on that road," he told Soren when the patrol leader came to him that morning. "The lone traveler. I want a name." It took 4 days to find her. She was in Ashran's Gate, helping Mardith prepare a poultice for a carpenter who had crushed 2 fingers under a falling beam. The healer's space was small and aromatic, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, jars of powders and oils arranged on shelves with the particular ordered chaos of a mind that knows exactly where everything is. Klaya was at the workbench in the back, her white hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck, her red servant's dress covered by a large apron, her hands steady and practiced as she worked the mixture. She did not hear the door open. She heard the change in the room, the way Mardith's voice, which had been running a low, comfortable monologue about the weather and the price of salt, simply stopped mid-sentence. The way the air shifted, the way a room shifts when something large and consequential has entered it. She turned. He was standing in the doorway. Tall was the first impression, but it was immediately inadequate. He was the kind of tall that reorganizes the spatial logic of a room, that makes walls seem closer and ceilings lower, not through any visible effort, but simply through the fact of his presence. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, thick and straight as a curtain of night, and his jaw carried a short beard that was neat without being studied. He wore practical clothing, no armor, but good leather, the kind that moves with a body rather than constraining it. And there was a quality to the way he stood that Klaya had no immediate word for. Not aggression, not display. Something more fundamental than either. A man who was simply, entirely himself, in the way that only people who have never needed to perform anything tend to be. His eyes found her. They were dark. Not merely brown, but the deep, absorptive dark of deep water. And they were looking at her with an attention that she was not accustomed to receiving. Not the attention of desire or calculation. The attention of genuine, focused curiosity. As if she were something he had been trying to understand before he had even met her. Mardith made a sound somewhere between a word and a cough, and straightened considerably, and began to say something about the honor of a visit. And then Dornant held up one hand, not dismissively, but with a quieting patience, and said simply, "I'm looking for Klaya Lagaster." Klaya set down the pestle. "That's me." He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than most moments. "My wolves found you on the eastern road." The words came quiet and certain. 5 days ago. It was not a question. She considered the space between them, the workbench, the hanging herbs, the morning light that came through the single window and lay across the floor in a gold bar. 2 white wolves. A pause. Very large. Asteron and Bionther. She repeated the names softly, not to test them but to feel them. Something about the way she said them, with the same careful, natural respect she would give any name, made something shift in the quality of his expression. A small thing, barely visible, but there. They don't usually do that. Stand guard over strangers? Stand guard over anyone who isn't already known to them. She considered this. The poultice could wait. She wiped her hands on the apron and faced him fully, and there was something in the straightness of her posture. Not pride, not defiance, just presence. That was not what he had expected from an Omega servant on a healer's stipend. He wasn't sure what he had expected exactly. Something smaller, perhaps. Something less still. I didn't call them to me. I wouldn't know how. They simply appeared. I know. That's what I'm trying to understand. Outside, Mardith found reasons to be busy in the other room. The morning continued its slow progress. And in the healer's workshop in Ashran's Gate, the Alpha King of the Southern Desert and a young Omega servant looked at each other across a workbench, scattered with herbs and dried roots. And something unnamed but persistent began to take shape in the space between them. He came back the following week. He had reasonable reasons, the kind he could explain to himself and to anyone who might ask. He wanted to observe Asteron and Bionther's behavior around her more closely, wanted to determine whether the patrol report represented an isolated anomaly or something repeatable. These were the reasons he offered himself, and they were not entirely false. But when he arrived in Ashran's Gate and found her in the small courtyard behind the healer's house, sitting on a low stone bench with her bag open beside her and a length of white cloth in her hands, wrapping a quantity of dried herbs with the methodical attention of someone who has learned that the small preparations are the things that determine outcomes. And when Asteron, who had accompanied him, walked directly to her and sat down at her feet without any instruction or encouragement, he understood that the reasons he had offered himself were not the only ones. She looked up at the wolf first, and her face did what he had not expected. It softened. Not in the way a person softens when they are trying to appear gentle, but in the way a person softens when they are genuinely glad to see someone. She set down the cloth and placed one hand on Asteron's broad white head, and the wolf closed its eyes. Then she looked up at him. He came back. He goes where he decides to go, Dornant said, which was more honest than he had planned to be. She smiled. just briefly, a small, precise thing, and returned her hand to her work. He sat on the wall across from her, because standing over people in the middle of small courtyards felt like an imposition, and she was clearly in the middle of something. They did not speak for a while. He found, unexpectedly, that he did not mind the silence. He was a man who spent most of his hours in conversation, consultation, negotiation, the specific relentless language of governance, and silence was something he reached for at the end of long days, a condition rather than a presence. But this was different. This silence had texture and weight, something that occupied the space without pressing on it. "Where do you go from here?" he asked eventually. "The valley settlement below the Red Cliffs, 3 days east. There's a widow there who needs help with a difficult pregnancy, and then back through Ashran's Gate, and then north toward the border villages if the weather holds." "Alone?" She glanced at him. "It's generally how I travel." "That road through the eastern corridor has 7 fewer men on it now, apparently. Without particular triumph, just statement." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The men who ran. They weren't acting alone. They're part of a larger group of renegades that has been operating through this region for the past season. The incident on the road it gave us their location and their pattern." He paused. "They haven't made any further moves yet, but they may." She looked at him properly now, setting down her cloth. "You're telling me something. I'm recommending caution." "That's kind." She said it plainly, without irony, and somehow the plainness made it land differently than gratitude tends to land. More direct, more real, a thing given rather than performed. "But I have people waiting. I can't stop moving because there are dangerous men in the desert. There are always dangerous men in the desert." He looked at her for a long moment. Asteron had laid his head across her knee and appeared to have gone to sleep, his enormous chest rising and falling with the deep cadence of an animal entirely at ease. "No," Dornant said finally. "I suppose there always are." He came back 3 more times over the following weeks. Each time, Bionther came with him on the second visit, and after that, both wolves seemed to orient toward Ashran's Gate whenever they were not otherwise directed. A behavioral shift so clear and consistent that even the soldiers who handled them commented on it to Soren, who wrote another notation in his log and said nothing to anyone except the Alpha King, who already knew. The visits changed shape gradually. The first few had the careful formality of 2 people who are aware that they are being observed by their own internal watching selves, by the part of the mind that notes with cautious significance that something unusual may be occurring. Then slowly, over the course of mornings spent in the courtyard, and one afternoon when a dust storm had kept them both inside Mardith's house for 3 hours, while the world outside turned amber and wild, they began to simply talk. He told her things about the territory, not the politics, not the strategy, but the land itself, the way the dunes shifted with the seasonal winds, the underground water channels that a person could learn to read from the surface if they paid the right kind of attention, the names the old settlements had before the official maps renamed them to something easier for northern administrators to pronounce. He told these things the way a person tells something they love to someone they trust will understand the love. She told him about the villages she visited, not the poverty or the difficulty, though both were real, but the specific, irreducible humanness of the people there. The grandmother in the valley settlement who had been growing the same variety of pepper plant for 40 years and would not consider any substitute. The children in the border villages who, regardless of how sick they were, always wanted to hear a story before they would drink the medicine. The old soldier in the garrison outpost, who asked for her every 6 weeks, not because he was ill, but because he wanted someone to talk to, who didn't know what he had done in the wars. Dornant listened to all of it with a quality of attention that Clya had not encountered before. Not the polite attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the deeper, quieter attention of someone who is actually receiving what is being offered, as if what she was saying mattered to the specific architecture of his understanding of the world. She was not accustomed to mattering. She was not accustomed to being listened to as though the texture of her days had weight. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the western dunes, and the sky above them transitioned through that particular sequence of desert colors, the deep orange giving way to rose, the rose to a purple so rich it looked painted, she found herself telling him about her childhood. Not the version she told most people, the simple summary of orphaned young, raised by a series of healers, trained in herbalism and medicine, not unhappy, not remarkable. The other version. The one about the loneliness that had lived inside that life like a permanent weather condition, not dramatic enough to name or address, just present, always present, the background climate of her existence. She stopped herself partway through and looked at her hands, embarrassed by the length of what she had said. "I'm sorry," she began. "Don't apologize," he said. And there was something in his voice that was not the formal quietness she had come to recognize as his default register. Something warmer, something that came from a different part of him. "Keep going." She looked at him. He was watching the sunset, but his attention was entirely on her. She could feel that. The specific, directional weight of being attended to by someone who was choosing to attend. She kept going. Later, walking home through the darkened streets of Ashran's Gate with both wolves flanking her in the warm night, a habit they had developed without any instruction from either human, she thought about what had happened and felt something she was not prepared to name. Something that had the quality of warmth, but also the quality of alarm. The kind of warmth that feels like standing too close to a fire. Good, necessary, but requiring you to decide how close you are willing to stand. The renegades made their move on the 43rd day after the incident on the road. They had regrouped by then, absorbed into a larger network of displaced pack members that operated in a loose, leaderless way across 3 regional territories. Their humiliation on the Eastern Road, 7 warriors driven off by 2 wolves and a girl who hadn't even raised her voice, had become a story that circulated with vicious efficiency through their ranks. The kind of story that accretes shame and converts it, in the minds of certain men, into the need for action. Any action. The shape of the action mattered less than the performance of it, the demonstration that they were still forces to be reckoned with, still capable of taking what they wanted from a world that had discarded them. They chose the valley settlement below the Red Cliffs. It was not entirely random. It was on Klaya's regular route, a detail that one of the 7 had noted after watching the road. Whether they intended it as a direct communication, or simply as the easiest available target, was a question that would remain unanswered. What mattered was the outcome. At roughly 2 hours before dawn, a group of 18 men moved into the settlement from the northern approach, intending to take what they could carry before the garrison patrol reached the area. What they did not account for was Dornant. He had received intelligence about potential movement 3 days earlier, a combination of patrol reports and information from a network of contacts embedded in the trading routes, and had ridden south with a unit of 40 soldiers, arriving at the Red Cliffs by nightfall and waiting there in silence, distributed across the terrain in the particular way he arranged his forces when he did not want to show his hand until he chose to. He was not, in the field, a remote commander. He did not position himself at the rear and issue instructions through intermediaries. He rode at the front of his unit, wore the same equipment as his soldiers, and expected himself to meet the same standards he held them to. This was not bravado. It was a deeply considered philosophy about what leadership required, about the specific quality of trust that could only be built by the leader's willingness to take the same risks they asked of others. His soldiers followed him with the particular loyalty that exists beyond rank or obligation, the kind that comes from a person rather than a position. When the renegades entered the valley settlement, they found it quiet. They moved through the outer ring of dwellings, and for perhaps 90 seconds, they may have believed the intelligence was wrong, that this was going to be easy. Then Dornant gave the signal. The engagement was brief and decisive. 18 renegades against 40 disciplined soldiers in prepared positions, with an alpha in command who thought several moves ahead and had prepared those moves in the days before the encounter. The renegades had numbers and desperation. His people had structure, preparation, and the specific advantage of knowing what was coming before it arrived. It was over before the settlement's residents had fully woken. 12 men were taken into custody. 6 had fled. None had reached the dwellings at the center of the settlement where the families lived. Dornant stood in the pre-dawn quiet afterward and looked at the valley, at the dark shapes of the dwellings against the first gray intimation of morning, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction. Satisfaction would have been too simple for this feeling, but something more, like the completion of a responsibility. He sent a rider to Ashran's gate at first light. She received the message by mid-morning. The settlement was safe, the renegades had been neutralized as a regional threat, the 6 who escaped had been tracked to the outer territories and were unlikely to return. The message was brief, practical. It contained no sentiment. At the bottom, in different handwriting than the formal report, his own, she recognized it by now. The slightly irregular spacing of a person who learned to write late and has never entirely made peace with the act, were 4 words. Everyone you help is safe. She held the paper for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in the inner pocket of her dress, close to her chest, and went back to her work. She did not see him for 11 days after that. She knew he was occupied. The aftermath of the capture required documentation, tribunal proceedings, the reassignment of patrol routes to account for the gaps the renegade network had been exploiting. These were not small tasks. She knew this because she knew him well enough now to understand the architecture of his responsibilities, the way governance pressed on him with the specific, inescapable weight of land that could not care for itself, of people who depended on the functioning of systems he was required to maintain. She did not mind the gap. She was practical about it, or tried to be. But she noticed it. She noticed it the way you notice the absence of a sound you had become accustomed to. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the small, persistent way of a silence that has shape. She noticed it when she worked in the evenings, and there was no voice in the room that asked questions with that particular quality of genuine interest. She noticed it when she walked through Ashran's gate, and both wolves, who had taken to spending time near the healer's house, seemed to orient slightly eastward at intervals throughout the day, the way animals orient toward something absent that they expect to return. She noticed, most of all, that she had started thinking about what she wanted to say to him. Not planned conversations, not rehearsed arguments, just things that occurred to her in the course of a day that she wanted to offer to someone who would receive them in the way he had a habit of receiving things. With attention. With that particular stillness. It was not a comfortable realization. She was an Omega servant. She had no standing, no resources, no lineage. She worked for healers in small villages and earned copper coins and wore a red dress she had repaired so many times that some of the fabric was more patch than original cloth. He governed a territory that spanned 300 leagues of desert, commanded a garrison of thousands, and made decisions that determined the economic fate of cities. The distance between those 2 lives was not a gap. It was a geography, an entire separate landscape of difference, and Clea Legaster had learned early and well that wishing across geographies was the most reliable path to a specific kind of grief. She was practical about it. She almost succeeded. On the 11th day, she was in the courtyard at dusk when she heard the gate, and looked up, and saw him. He was alone. No soldiers, no formal escort. Just him and the 2 wolves who had run ahead of him, and were already in the courtyard, already orienting toward her, already making the small adjustments of posture and movement that living things make when they are happy to be somewhere. He looked tired. Not the bone-deep tiredness of illness, but the particular tiredness of having spent 11 days in the unrelenting machinery of responsibility without a break. There were new lines at the corners of his eyes that she did not remember from before, or perhaps she simply hadn't looked carefully enough. He stopped at the gate. "I should have sent word," he said. "You were busy," she said. "Still." He paused. "I wanted to make sure you'd received the message. About the settlement." "I received it." Something moved across his face. A calculation, or the decision to set calculation aside. He stepped into the courtyard, and Beyanther pressed its vast white head against his leg in greeting, and he rested one hand briefly on the wolf's neck, in the unconscious automatic way of someone who has been doing this his whole life. "How are the families in the valley?" she asked. "Unharmed, frightened, but unharmed. And the families you were worried about, the ones near the northern pass?" "Relocated to the garrison settlement for the season. The road is being repatrolled at double frequency." She nodded. She was watching him the way she sometimes watched him without meaning to, looking for the thing beneath the thing. The way he held himself when he was tired, the specific quality of quiet that came over him when he had just completed something difficult and needed a moment before the next requirement appeared. "Sit down." He looked at her. "You look like you've been standing for 11 days, she said. "Sit down." He sat. It was such a small thing. He sat on the stone wall, and she returned to the bench, and the wolves settled between them in the warm dusk, and the sky above the desert began its nightly transformation from gold to amber, to the deep dimensional blue that precedes the stars. They did not say much. They did not need to. The silence between them had long since stopped being the silence of two people who do not know each other and become something else. The silence of two people who trust the space they inhabit together, who do not need to fill it to justify it. After a while, he said quietly, "Do you know what it's like to be responsible for something so large that you can't see all of it at once?" She thought about it genuinely. "No, I'm responsible for small things, individual people, specific symptoms with specific remedies. I can always see all of it at once." "I used to be able to see all of it," he said. Not complaint, statement, precise and considered. "When my father governed this territory, I used to watch him and think the problem was simply one of scale, that if you had enough resources and enough people and enough systems, you could make everything visible, manage everything." He paused. "You can't. There's always the part that's beyond the edge of what you can hold." "Is that what kept you away for 11 days? He looked at her. "Among other things." The stars were beginning to appear. The desert night had that quality it gets in the deep, dry season. The air so clear and still that the stars seemed close enough to be things, rather than distances. The kind of sky that makes the scale of a human life feel briefly, tolerably small. "What were the other things?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I was trying to determine," he said carefully, "whether I was here for the reasons I told myself I was here, or for different reasons." She was very still. "And did you determine it?" "Yes," he said. He did not elaborate. Not yet. The night was there, and she was there, and the wolves were there, and the stars were arranging themselves overhead in their ancient and indifferent patterns. And he was sitting on a wall in a small courtyard in a village that was not his city. And he was more at rest than he had been in 11 days. In longer than 11 days. In longer than he could easily calculate. She did not press him. She was not a person who pressed. She waited, in the way she waited beside sick people who needed to find their own path to speaking, in the way she waited for things to be ready rather than forcing them into readiness before their time. He looked at the stars. "I kept thinking," he said, "about what you said, about the children who need a story before they'll drink the medicine." She turned toward him slightly. "It's just something they need." "I know. That's what I kept thinking about." She waited. "I think," he said slowly, "I have been governing this territory for 9 years, the way those children drink the medicine without the story, without the thing that makes it possible to accept the difficult part." He paused. "I've been efficient, and I've been thorough, and I have kept everything functioning, and I have done it completely alone because I was taught, very young, that relying on anyone is a risk you cannot afford when everything depends on your ability to continue. He looked at her then, directly at her, in the way he rarely did. Not the assessing attention of the man who was trying to understand something, but a different quality of looking, something open and certain and slightly terrifying in its honesty. "You make it feel less alone," he said. "I don't know if that's—" He stopped, began again. "I'm not certain how to say this in a way that doesn't ask more than I have the right to ask." Klaya looked at him for a long time. "You can say it," he said. "I don't want to stop coming here." The night held them both in its enormous, starred silence. "I don't want you to stop coming here." Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not like a wall falling, more like a lamp being lit in a room that has been dark long enough that you had forgotten what the room looked like when it was lit. Not sudden, not violent, simply illuminated. He reached across the space between them and placed his hand over hers on the bench. She looked down at their hands. His was much larger, dark-weathered, scarred across the knuckles in the specific way of a man who has fought with his hands rather than just directed others to fight. Hers was small and pale and work-calloused, stained faintly at the fingertips from the herbs she handled. Together they looked unlikely. Together they looked, somehow, like something that made sense in a way that was larger than either component. She turned her hand over beneath his and held on. Asteron sighed in his sleep, the long, contented exhalation of an animal whose equilibrium has been satisfied. The weeks that followed had the quality of something growing, not loudly, not in the way of sudden transformation, but in the way of a plant that has been kept in insufficient light and then moved to a window, the change happening at the cellular level before it becomes visible, the organism quietly reorganizing itself around the new condition of being nourished. He arranged his schedule, which had been a rigid architecture of obligation and efficiency, to include Ashran's gait. Not irregularly, not as a luxury, but as a standing element, a thing acknowledged and accounted for. Soren noticed and wrote a new kind of notation in the patrol log, different from the analytical ones. The garrison soldiers noticed and said various things to each other, mostly flattering, because Dornant Mykonos was a man whose soldiers chose to be loyal to him, and people who choose their loyalty tend to want their chosen person to have the things that make a life complete. Klaya, for her part, was navigating something she had no map for. She understood generosity. She understood competence and patience, and the long practical labor of caring for others. She understood loneliness, in great depth, and she understood the specific quiet satisfaction of useful work. What she did not have a reliable map for was this: someone caring for her, someone asking how she was not as prelude to asking something else, but as the actual question. Someone paying attention to her days as a thing of genuine interest. She found, over time, that she was not as afraid of it as she had expected to be. There was one afternoon, a week into what neither of them had yet named, but both understood to have a name, when she was preparing a batch of fever remedy at the workbench, and she reached for a jar on the upper shelf that was slightly too high, and before she could pull the stool over, there was a hand reaching past her shoulder and bringing the jar down with the easy reach of someone 14 inches taller. She turned, and he was there, closer than she had expected, close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow that she had never been near enough to notice before, close enough to see that his eyes were not simply dark, but had depth in them, the way deep water has depth, the way you could keep looking and keep finding. She forgot for a moment what she had been doing. He did not step back, but he watched her with an attention that was careful and patient and entirely warm. The face of a man who is choosing to wait for something rather than press toward it, who has learned, or perhaps has always known, that the things most worth having are the ones that come toward you, rather than the ones you reach for. "Thank you." "Anytime," he said, and the simplicity of it, the absolute, unqualified simplicity, was the thing that stayed with her for the rest of the day. He had a quality, she was learning, of saying things as he meant them. Not elaborately, not with the protective layer of irony or deflection that many people use to soften the vulnerability of sincerity. He said what he meant, directly, and trusted her to receive it. This was, she was discovering, the most disorienting form of respect she had ever been offered. She began to offer it back. Slowly, in small ways. Telling him things she would not normally tell anyone. Not secrets, exactly, but the honest textures of her inner life, the things she thought about at night. The ways in which the work she did filled her but did not entirely satisfy some deeper hunger she had never had the occasion to name before. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention, the same stillness, receiving each thing she offered as if it had weight and worth. One evening he asked her what she wanted. Not what she wanted from a conversation or from the evening. What she wanted from her life, for herself. She stopped and thought about it in a way she had rarely been given the occasion to. And what she discovered, sitting in that honest space his question had opened, was that she wanted the same thing she had always done. The work, the villages, the herbs, the people, but wanted it in the context of not being alone while she did it. She wanted the work and someone to come back to. She wanted usefulness and belonging in the same life, which she had thought was not available to her, which she had quietly stopped hoping for and reclassified as an indulgence. She told him this. He was quiet for a long moment. "That's not an indulgence," he said. "That's what people are for." She looked at him. "What people are for?" she repeated. "Coming back to, belonging to, and having belonged to you. I've run this territory for 9 years with perfect efficiency and very little belonging. It's not—" He paused, and she saw him choosing words with the care of someone for whom the right word matters. "It's not enough. I didn't let myself see that clearly until recently." She understood he meant until her. She understood, sitting in the warm desert evening with the stars appearing one by one overhead, and both wolves lying at their feet like enormous white guardian spirits, that she was not navigating this alone, that whatever this was, whatever was building between them, day by day, visit by visit, word by word, and silence by silence, he was building it with her, with the same careful intention, the same honest recognition of what it meant. He was not passing time. He was not conducting research into wolf behavior. He was not here out of curiosity or proximity or the absent force of habit. He was here because she was here. The understanding settled into her like water settling into dry ground, filling spaces she had not known were empty. The city of Dakareth was built in the natural basin, formed by a semicircle of ancient stone cliffs, the rock face scored over centuries by wind into shapes that looked, from a distance, like writing in a language no one alive could read anymore. It had been the capital of the Southern Territory for 200 years, a city of sandstone and terracotta, of covered markets and deep wells, and the low, wide architecture that the desert demands. Nothing too tall, nothing that catches wind unnecessarily, everything designed for endurance over elegance, though the two had, over time, arrived at an unexpected agreement, and the city was both. Klaya had never been to Dakareth. She had passed through its outer trade settlements, had treated patients from the city's surrounding villages, had heard it described by a dozen people in a dozen different registers: awe, nostalgia, homesickness, pride. But the city itself had always been beyond the edge of her rote, a rumored magnitude rather than a known place. He brought her in a week before the spring trade season, when the caravans from the salt flats were beginning to move and the city's commerce was in its preparatory intensification. He had told her several days before that he would like to show her something and had not elaborated, and she had learned by then to trust his incomplete sentences. She had expected something official, some version of a formal introduction to a formal place. What she found instead was him, showing her the city the way he had told her about the territory, not through its official face, not through the impressive facade of markets and garrison buildings and administrative halls, but through the things he loved about it. The neighborhood in the western quarter, where, for reasons no historian had satisfactorily explained, every building was painted a different shade of blue, so that walking through it felt like moving through a dream of the sky. The ancient well at the center of the old city district that was so deep you could drop a stone and not hear it land. The archive room in the base of the east cliff where the old records were kept, smelling of dry parchment and centuries, where he had spent long hours as a young man, reading the accounts of the territory's history, and trying to understand the world he was being prepared to govern. She listened to all of it the way she listened to him when he talked about the things that mattered, with her whole attention, with the part of herself she kept most carefully in reserve because it was the most vulnerable part, the part that receives things rather than manages them. By the time they reached the high platform above the western gate, where the entire city spread below them, and the desert extended beyond it in every direction to the limits of vision, she understood something she had been working toward understanding for weeks. She loved him. Not the precipitous, destabilizing love of someone who has been swept off their feet. She had not been swept. She had walked here, step by measured step, carried by her own will. Not the confused love of someone who mistakes intensity for feeling. This was something quieter and more thorough, something that had grown through the layers of attention and trust and time and genuine knowing, the way a tree grows through the patient accumulation of rings. She loved the way he said difficult things directly. She loved the way he was enormous and fierce and absolutely capable of terrible authority toward anyone who threatened what he was responsible for, and then would sit in her courtyard with his wolves asleep at his feet and listen to her talk about an old soldier who was lonely, with an expression of complete and undefended tenderness. She loved the duality of him, the fire that faced outward and the warmth that faced in, the two existing not in contradiction, but in the same person simultaneously, the same heart accommodating both. She loved that his wolves had chosen her before he had, and that when she had once mentioned this to him, smiling, he had said without hesitation, "They have better instincts than I do. They just act on them faster." She did not say any of this on the platform above the western gate. She stood beside him in the warm morning wind and looked out at the city she was learning to see through his eyes, and she felt the full, completed weight of what had grown between them, and she held it carefully, the way she held things that were precious and real. He was looking at her. She could feel it, the specific direction of it, the particular quality of attention she had learned to recognize as his and his alone. She turned. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the considering attention, or the warm patience, or the precise, contained feeling of a man who is choosing his words. This was something more open than all of those, something that had let the careful architecture down, that was looking at her from the interior of itself without the mediating layer of control. "You're looking at me. I'm always looking at you," he said. She felt the warmth of it move through her like the desert air on a clear morning. Clean, present, completely real. "Klaya," he said, and the way he said her name, the particular quality of attention he gave to it, as if the name itself were worth treating with care, made something in her chest tighten and release simultaneously. "Yes," she said. "I want to ask you something." He paused. "And I want to ask it without making it into anything official or formal. I want to ask it as myself." She waited. He reached out and took her hand, both hands, her small weathered hands and his larger scarred ones, held with a gentleness entirely disproportionate to his strength, the gentleness of someone who understands the difference between what they are capable of and what the situation calls for. "I would like," he said, "for you to let me be the person you come back to. And I would like to be the person you come back to for a long time." The city breathed below them. The desert stretched. The wind moved through the space between them with the indifferent, ancient warmth of the deep south. She looked at their hands, then at his face. "Yes," And then, because that felt insufficient for everything it contained, I would like that very much. Something in his expression did the thing she had come to love. The lighting, the illumination, the room lit from inside quality that she had first seen on the night in the courtyard, and that she understood now was the specific look of a man allowing himself something he had not allowed himself in a long time. He brought her hands to his lips. Not a formal gesture. Something more private than that. More genuine. The way a person touches something they are grateful for. Asteron, who had followed them up to the platform and was sitting 3 feet away observing everything with the judgmental serenity of an animal who considers itself to have been involved in this outcome from the beginning, made a small, satisfied sound and lay down. Klaya laughed, a real laugh, sudden and clear, the kind that happens when you are too full of feeling to contain it all in silence. He looked at her laughing, and the expression on his face was something she would carry for a long time, pressed carefully between the other things she kept close. The look of a man who has, after a long dry season, reached water. The desert continued its ancient rhythms regardless. The trade season turned. The caravans moved across the routes that Dornant maintained, and the garrison patrols kept their intervals, and the villages at the edges of the territory received their routes of supply and protection with the reliable regularity that 9 years of careful governance had established. People went about the intricate machinery of their lives without awareness of the specific emotional weather occurring in the capital city, as people tend to do, being occupied with their own. But the people of Ashran's Gate noticed, and the soldiers of the Dakarith garrison noticed. And Mardith, who was not a person given to romantic sentiment, but had watched the whole thing develop with the attentiveness of a scientist observing a particularly interesting experiment, noticed most of all. Klaya continued her routes. This was important to her, and Dornant understood it, not with the graceful tolerance of a man accepting something inconvenient, but with a genuine comprehension of why it mattered. The work she did was not incidental to who she was. It was constitutive. The villages, the people, the herbs and the remedies, and the long walks between one need and the next. This was where her identity lived, in the specific practical application of her care for others. To remove it, even in exchange for something good, would be to remove something essential from the person he had come to love. He would not do that. Instead, he restructured things. He assigned a small garrison detail to travel with her. Not visibly, not in a way that would make her arrivals into official events that would change the nature of the relationships she had built, but present, at a discreet distance, on the road she traveled. He knew she would push back on this. He told her about it directly, without asking permission, but with the specific honesty of a person who is acknowledging that he is acting on his own need rather than hers. "I know you don't need it," he said. "The arrangement is for me." She considered this, considered him. "All right, but they stay out of sight." "They'll stay out of sight." She nodded, and went back to her preparations, and he stood in the doorway of the healer's workshop watching her work, and felt something he had no single word for. A compound thing, made of gratitude and relief, and a kind of sustained, low-level wonder at the fact that she existed, that she was real, that she was here, and that she was his, and that he was hers, in the specific reciprocal way that such things work when they work properly. She looked up and caught him watching. "You could come in. The doorway isn't a very comfortable observation point." He came in. He sat at the workbench across from her and watched her sort dried herbs into categories with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this so many times. The hands know the work before the mind directs them, and they talked about nothing in particular. About the weather, about a disagreement between 2 trade guilds that was consuming a significant portion of his administrative attention, about a new healer who had arrived in the border villages, and whom Klaya thought might become a useful regional contact. The ordinary texture of a shared life, the small, specific conversations that accumulate, over months and years, into the architecture of belonging. This was what she had wanted, she thought. Not the dramatic version of love, not the rescue or the transformation or the sudden overwhelming deluge of feeling that changed everything at once. This, the bench and the herbs and the voice in the room that asked real questions and offered real attention, the presence that made the ordinary day feel inhabited. This was the story, and it was enough. The night they named it was the last night of the deep dry season, the night before the first rains were expected, when the desert sky takes on a particular quality, a density, a closeness, that the people of the Southern Territory call the held breath of the year. It is the night when everything is waiting, and the weight of the waiting is itself almost unbearable in its beauty. They had walked out beyond the edge of Ashran's gate to the open flat of the desert, the way they sometimes did in the evenings, the two wolves moving silently ahead of them in the darkness, their white coats luminous against the sand. The stars overhead were immense. The air was warm and very still. He had been quiet for much of the walk, and she had let him be quiet, understanding by now the particular quality of his silences. This one was the silence of someone who is organizing something within themselves, who needs the quiet to work with. They stopped at a natural rise in the ground, a low shelf of sandstone that gave a view of the plain stretching away in all directions. He spread the blanket he had brought. They sat. The wolves settled on the sand below them. Astharon with his chin on his paws, Beyanther sitting upright with the composed authority of an animal performing a function. Dornant looked at the stars for a long time. Then he turned to her, and she could see in the starlight the particular stillness that came over him when he was about to say something real. The slight forward lean, the way the habitual guardedness of his expression released itself. "I want to tell you something," he said, "about why I am the way I am." She was still. He told her about his father, not the careful public version, the strong leader, the decisive governor, the man whose legacy Dornant had been built to continue. The other version. The man who had governed effectively and cared efficiently and been deeply, constitutionally unable to allow anyone close enough to matter, because mattering to someone meant that person had the capacity to diminish you, and diminishment was a risk his father could not metabolize. The man who had taught his son, through years of precise and well-meaning instruction, that strength and need existed in opposition to each other, that a person in authority could not afford to want things that were beyond their control. He had died suddenly, of an illness that progressed so quickly there was no preparation. Dornant had been 25. He had grieved the way his father would have approved of, briefly, practically, without excess. He was telling her this as the story beneath the story, the context for the 9 years of efficient, solitary governance, for the wolves who were trained to bond to him alone, for the specific quality of guardedness she had been, slowly and with great care, permitted inside. "I don't know how to do this imperfectly," he said. "I don't know how to want something and also be willing to be wrong about it or to lose it. I've never learned that." She was looking at him with the full warmth of her attention. "Neither have I. I've just been doing it by accident my whole life." He looked at her, something that was almost a smile. "Is that reassuring?" he asked. "I think it might be, because neither of us knows what we're doing, which means we have to figure it out together, and together seems better than alone." He reached out and touched her face, his hand against her cheek, careful and certain, the way he touched things that mattered. She leaned into it without thinking, the instinctive movement of something seeking warmth. "Together," he said, as if the word were a thing he was testing for solidity and finding it sound. He looked at her for a long moment, in the held breath dark of the desert night, with the stars overhead, and the wolves below, and the year waiting on the edge of the rains. And she looked back at him, with everything she had learned to stop hiding, and the space between them contained years' worth of loneliness arriving, finally, at its end. "Claia Legaster." "Dornant Mykonos," she answered. He smiled then. A full smile, unguarded, the smile of a man who has stopped managing the distance between himself and the things he wants. And it was devastating in the specific way that rarely offered things tend to be, concentrated by rarity, brilliant in proportion to how long it had been kept. He folded her into his arms, and she let herself be folded. Not with the passivity of someone yielding to something larger, but with the active, choosing quality of someone arriving somewhere they have been traveling toward for a long time. His arms around her were exactly as careful as she had always expected they would be, the careful of someone who knows the full extent of their own strength, and therefore never uses more of it than the moment requires. She pressed her face against the warmth of his chest, and felt, for the first time in memory, the specific quality of safety that is not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone who would face the danger alongside you. Below them, Asteron lifted his great head and regarded them both with the serene, knowing expression of an animal whose assessments have been conclusively validated. Then he lay back down, satisfied. The first rain came before dawn. It began as a sound before it became a feeling. The distant percussion of drops against the sandstone plain, moving closer, the desert receiving its seasonal blessing with the particular intensity of terrain that has been waiting. By the time it reached them, still sitting on the stone shelf under the open sky, it was a soft but certain presence, cool against the warmth of the night, smelling of something ancient and clean. They did not move immediately. She turned her face up into it, and the rain fell on her white hair and her closed eyes and the curve of her cheek, and she was smiling in the way of someone receiving exactly what they needed at exactly the right moment. He watched her for a moment, that particular quality of watching that was attention and love and gratitude all organized together, and then he reached up and let the rain fall on his palm, and he looked at the water there, and something in him that had been held very tightly for a very long time released itself into the dark and the rain and the presence of her beside him. The wolves stood and shook themselves and circled, aware that the world was shifting into its new configuration, as they always were. The desert floor, which had been the color of dry gold for months, began its slow, invisible absorption. Somewhere beneath it, the deep aquifers that kept this territory alive were receiving their replenishment, the annual exchange between sky and earth that made everything possible. She took his hand. He held on, and in that moment, standing at the edge of the city that was his responsibility and his inheritance, in the first rain of the new season, with the woman who had taught him, without intending to, that strength and tenderness were not opposites but companions, that governance without love was simply management, that a life fully executed in the absence of belonging was a form of the very poverty he spent his years working to eliminate. In that moment, Dornit Mykonos felt something settle into him like water settling into parched ground. Not completion, exactly, not the clean arrival at a final destination, but something more honest than that. The feeling of being on the right road for the first time. The feeling of moving toward something rather than maintaining something. The feeling of a future that contained, alongside all its obligation and difficulty, and the endless demanding labor of keeping things alive. Someone who knew him, not the function, not the title, not the capability, but the person inside all of it. The man who had loved 2 white wolves since they were small enough to fit in the crook of his arm, and who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone those wolves would choose too. She knew all of this without him saying it. She could feel it in the way he held her hand, in the particular way he stood beside her, close but not crowding, present but not consuming, the specific geometry of a person who has learned, is learning, was always in the process of learning, how to be near someone without needing to contain them. What happens now? The words came softly, into the rain. He thought about it. Now, he said. The rain fills the aquifers, and the caravans prepare for the trade season. And the patrol routes resume their schedule. And you go to the valley settlement in 3 days because the widow there needs you. She turned her head to look at him. And I'll be here when you come back, he said. and I'll be there when you arrive. And somewhere in between all of it, we'll figure out the rest." The rain fell softly on the desert. The wolves shook themselves and pressed close on either side. She tightened her hand around his and looked out at the dark plain, the invisible distances, the world that was the same as it had been an hour ago, and completely different. Yes, that sounds right. Many seasons later, when the story of Clya Legaster and Dornant Mykonos was one that people told in the villages and the garrison settlements, the way people tell the stories that confirm something they want to believe is true about the world, the version most commonly told began in the middle, at the point of consequence rather than cause. It began, in most tellings, with the 7 warriors. The renegades who had seen a young Omega servant walking alone on a desert road and had made the exact error that certain men always make. They looked at what was small and alone and assumed it was therefore without protection, without history, without the kind of weight that determines outcomes. They had not looked carefully enough. They had not seen the invisible threads that connect certain people to certain things, the old agreements between living creatures that do not require language or transaction, the fact that the world sometimes arranges itself around a person's goodness, in ways that that person is the last to notice. They had not seen the white wolves. They had not seen who those wolves belonged to, and who they had decided, in the ancient, non-negotiable way of creatures that know what they know, to extend that belonging toward. And they had not seen, perhaps most importantly, what they had set in motion by running. Because in running from those wolves and that girl, they had carried a story back into the world. A story that traveled through patrol logs and garrison reports until it landed on a desk in a high stone room in a city made of sandstone and wind-carved cliffs, in front of a man who read it twice and looked out at the desert and decided to go find the person his wolves had chosen. In some versions of the story, people focused on the romance. In others, they focused on the wolves, on the particular legendary nature of Asteron and Bionther, who became figures in their own right, emblems of something that the people of the territory already believed, that the desert has its own intelligence, that it keeps its own records, that it knows who belongs within it. In Clya's version, the one she carried internally, the one she would have told if anyone had asked her to tell it from her own point of view, it was simpler than all the others. She had been walking. She had been alone. The desert, in its ancient and indifferent way, had been paying attention, and everything that had followed from the fact of a young woman holding tightly to a bag of medicinal herbs, refusing to let go of what she was carrying to help others, even when 7 men told her she should. She had held on, and the world had rearranged itself around that holding. On the anniversary of the first rain, the year after they had stood in the downpour and held hands on the edge of the city, she was back in the courtyard of the healer's house in Ashran's Gate. Not because she lived there. She had by then a different place, a permanent place, the kind of place that waits for you when you come back from the work. But she was there for an afternoon, helping Mardith with a batch of complex remedy that required 2 sets of hands. She was at the workbench when she heard the gate. She did not look up. She knew the sound of his footsteps on the stone, had learned them over the accumulated months, with the reliable accuracy of a person who has made a study of something important. She knew the particular rhythm of his walk, the way it was unhurried but covered ground quickly, the specificity of a body that has learned to be efficient in its movement without sacrificing its deliberateness. She kept working. A hand came to rest on her shoulder. Warm, familiar, the exact weight and placement of a touch she had come to know as well as any landmark, and she leaned back slightly into it without thinking, the instinctive movement of someone who has found their equilibrium and settled into it. "How are the patients?" he said, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence along her back. "Better," she said. "The compound remedy is working faster than I expected." "Good." Asteron appeared from behind him and pressed his great head against her hip, and she reached down with her free hand to lay it along the wolf's jaw, and felt the deep, reverberant contentment of the animal beneath her palm. "Are you staying tonight?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She smiled at the workbench, at her hands, at the herbs and the jars and the quiet functionality of the room. "Good," she said. And it was. Outside, the desert held its breath and breathed, the way it always had, the way it always would. The dunes shifted, the roots wound on, the stars arranged themselves in their ancient patterns over the vast living silence of the south. And in a small courtyard in a village that most maps considered too small to mark, 2 white wolves lay in the afternoon sun and watched over everything, as they had been trained to do and had chosen to continue doing, as they would go on doing for as long as the world had need of watching over, which is to say, for a very long time, which is to say, perhaps, forever. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.